two young guys break into their neighbor's house, but strangely, they're not there to steal anything. Instead, they start installing surveillance cameras in every corner of the house. From now on, every word, every move the neighbor makes will be captured on camera. No privacy whatsoever. Then they tamper with the bottom of the back door, the ceiling light, and even the window glass of the master bedroom. And the reason behind all this? Pretty bizarre. The two want to use their neighbor as the unsuspecting star of a series of staged paranormal events. They'd film his reactions, post the videos on social media, and rake in views. For their experiment, they specifically picked a reclusive elderly man living alone, convinced his reactions to these spooky incidents would make their videos go viral overnight. To pull it off, they used the most advanced gear on the market, crystal clear footage day and night, real-time wireless streaming, even anti-interference features, all to guarantee a full month of stable operation. Soon enough, the old man's image popped up on their screen. Seeing this, Jake couldn't help but smirk. The two were already daydreaming about becoming internet sensations. The next day, they got more intel from a friend. The neighbor was a total loner, never socialized with anyone. He'd even kicked his own kids out of the house. For over a decade, the local rumor mill had painted him as a creep who beat his wife and killed his dog. But instead of backing off, these rumors only got the two more excited. Soon, they launched their first experiment. Using a device they'd planted in the light fixture, they remotely cut the power inside the house. The neighbor was quickly jolted awake by strange noises, and within seconds, the lights went completely dark. The two stared at the monitor, terrified of missing a single detail, but the result was a bit of a letdown. The neighbor just walked into the room and checked whether the breaker had tripped. Just then, urgent knocking came from outside. To figure out what was going on, Jake quickly switched the power back on. The neighbor, full of suspicion, walked to the door. Turns out, the sudden power outage had triggered the security alarm. A patrol officer had come by to check on him, but the old man brushed it off, sending the concerned officer away.
And the only disturbance I've had tonight is you.
Once back inside, to avoid being disturbed again, he just ripped the alarm right off the wall. Jake and Sean were completely confused by this. Since they hadn't installed any audio devices in that area, they had no idea what had just happened. They could only watch as the well-meaning officer walked away. Frustrated, the next day, Jake noticed a visitor showing up at the neighbor's door. But strangely, the old man had no intention of opening it. He even rushed forward to lock the door, terrified the visitor might know he was inside. Seeing no one was answering, the woman left the documents at the door and walked away. The moment she was gone, the old man opened the door and grabbed the papers. But the very next second, he tore them to shreds and tossed them in the trash. Watching this, the two frowned. A little later, they saw the neighbor accidentally knock over the trash can. A kind neighbor walking his dog stopped by and offered to help, only to be cursed out by the old man. Turns out, the guy's dog kept peeing in front of the old man's door, like it was marking territory. Completely ignoring him, the old man then issued a vicious warning to the dog owner.
Maybe I should teach him a lesson. Keep that son of a bitch on a leash, okay? Because the next time, if it happens again, I'm gonna cut him in 4 pieces and send him home in his can.
Let's go, boy.
Let's go, boy.
After watching for a few days, the two became more and more fascinated by the neighbor's bizarre behavior and even more confident about what was coming next.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is part 2 of a segment that I like to call Knock Knock. You ready? All right.
The dull thud of pounding on a door shattered the dead silence of the night, instantly waking the neighbor. The two in front of the screens were thrilled. On the monitor, the neighbor threw on a coat and walked toward the back door with unsteady steps and a blank expression. But strangely, he didn't seem startled by the sudden noise at all. He just pulled open the inner door, his face emotionless. Jake and Sean held their breath, eagerly waiting to see what he'd do next. But in the next second, the neighbor walked out of frame. Panicked, the two switched cameras to track him down. At first they were stunned. Was he really just going to ignore the terrifying banging? But moments later, the neighbor reappeared. Clutching an axe, he started hacking wildly at that door. Each swing carried suppressed rage and violence pushed to the breaking point. The piercing sound of chopping was downright horrifying in the dead of night. He didn't stop until that door was reduced to splinters. Jake and Sean were completely stunned by what they just witnessed. The neighbor on the monitor looked downright vicious, like a butcher who wouldn't blink while killing. Just when they thought it was over, they suddenly noticed the neighbor staring directly at the hidden camera. Did he know all along that they were behind this? Jake quickly grabbed the camcorder beside him to capture the moment, then zoomed in to get a closer look. Turned out the neighbor was just staring at the wall across the room. They'd been so on edge they'd imagined being caught. But the moment they relaxed, the neighbor disappeared from the monitor again, axe still in hand. The two frantically searched for him on every camera, but he was nowhere to be found.
Where is he?
Ethan, you swear he didn't see us?
Maybe he'll leave.
Suddenly, urgent knocking came from outside. Had the neighbor actually come for them? Jake rushed over and grabbed a hockey stick, ready to face him down. He even reminded Sean to film the whole thing. But when Jake opened the door, there was nothing, dead silence. The two cautiously stepped outside.
There you are!
Turns out it was Sean's dad. He hadn't been able to reach Sean, so he'd come over to pick him up. When Sean got back inside, he saw on the monitor that the neighbor had simply set the axe down in the corner by the back door. The man himself was now slumped on the couch, completely drained. A few days later, Jake noticed something odd. Ever since that night with the eerie pounding, the neighbor hadn't stepped foot outside. He just stayed shut up in that dead silent house, day after day. He showed zero reaction to all the strange events happening around him, as if none of it fazed him at all. This unsettling calm only fueled Jake's twisted excitement for what was coming next. Soon, they kicked off their third experiment. At first, the two figured the door-banging stunt had been too sudden, too intense, that's why he'd snapped so violently. So this time, they decided to try something gentler, but somehow even creepier. While the neighbor was sound asleep, they remotely fired up an old stereo in his house. The sudden burst of music in the dead of night should have scared him out of his skin. Sure enough, the music jolted him awake. The two glued their eyes to the screen, dying to see him panic. But once again, he surprised them. He just glanced into that room, then turned and walked back to the living room. Not a flicker of emotion.
That's interesting. At least he didn't hit it with an axe.
It wasn't until the next day that Sean spotted something deeply unsettling on the footage. The neighbor had walked into the basement at 11:38 p.m. the night before and didn't come out until 6:55 the next morning. That's 7 hours alone in the basement. What on earth was down there that kept him for so long? Had the unexplained music spooked him so badly he hid in the basement and refused to come out? A few days later, the two prepared their final paranormal stunt. They'd already coated the bedroom window with a chemical solution. All they had to do was kill the heater, the temperature would plummet, and the glass would shatter. At 3 a.m., the neighbor was jolted awake by the sound of glass cracking. He sat up sharply, threw a blanket around his shoulders, and hurried into the hallway. The thermostat reading was dropping fast. Thinking it was a malfunction, he tapped at it a few times. Just 2 seconds later, he heard another sound and rushed back to the bedroom. The window was shattered to pieces on the floor, but once again, he showed no fear, no panic. His behavior, though, was getting stranger. He took off his coat, walked straight to the mirror, and started slowly combing his hair. Then he sat down at the edge of the bed, breathing heavily. He stayed like that from just after 3 a.m. until 5:14, then walked toward the basement. But Jake and Sean had noticed when installing the cameras that basement door was always locked. They had no idea what he was doing down there. Over the following days, the neighbor's condition kept deteriorating. Even during the day, he was constantly going in and out of the basement. At night, he'd just sit in his chair, drinking non-stop. By now, the two were convinced he really was the twisted butcher the rumors made him out to be. There had to be someone locked up in that basement. Their experiments must have amplified his fear, which is why he kept hiding down there. They quickly hatched a plan. First, they'd install an audio device near his front door. Then that night, they'd call in a tip to the police, getting officers to search the basement. That way, they'd finally know what was hidden down there. The two split up. Sean stayed by the cameras, recording everything and tracking the neighbor's movements. But just then, the signal cut out for a few seconds. When the screen came back on, the neighbor was already heading toward the front door. To make matters worse, Jake had just knocked over a kettle outside, and the noise had put the neighbor on alert. Luckily, the old man only stepped out to take a look and didn't get suspicious. Otherwise, the whole plan would have been blown. That night, when the neighbor had let his guard down, the two made the call.
Hi, yes, Asheville Police Department?
Police arrived quickly, using the dog owner's name from before. The two told officers they'd heard a woman screaming from inside his basement. The neighbor had no choice but to cooperate and let them search. But to their shock, the officer came back up just minutes later. Nothing.
You've got to be kidding me.
You didn't find anything?
He wasn't looking hard enough.
A few days later, Jake's curiosity had grown into full-blown obsession. He couldn't let this experiment end with nothing. He went to Sean with a new idea. Since the cops found nothing, why not break into the basement themselves and see for sure? Sean shut him down immediately. Jake tried to convince him, yeah, it was risky, but if their suspicions were right, not only would they avoid jail time for spying, they'd become famous overnight. Sean wouldn't budge. The two had a huge fight and parted ways. A week passed. Then one day, the neighbor's cat accidentally knocked one of the hidden cameras off the wall. The two rushed to the screen, hearts pounding. The camera lay there in plain sight, covered in their fingerprints. The moment the neighbor woke up the next morning, he'd find it. Their entire operation would be exposed. Jake came up with an idea on the spot. The neighbor was still asleep, they could sneak in, grab the camera, and that'd be the end of it. Sean reluctantly gave in and let Jake go alone, while he stayed back to watch the monitors. If anything went wrong, he'd warn Jake right away. Jake quickly got the door open and headed straight for the camera. But what Sean didn't know was that Jake had brought a handgun with him.
Oh God.
Jake found the camera quickly, Sean kept his eyes locked on the screen, terrified of any slip-up. Just when it seemed like everything would go smoothly, Jake noticed the basement door was unlocked. His curiosity took over. Without hesitation, he walked straight toward it, watching from afar. Sean was furious and helpless. All he could do was switch cameras and keep tabs on the neighbor. Jake crept down into the basement, recording everything with his handheld camera. There was a table covered with an old white cloth, like it was hiding something nobody was meant to see. After a moment, he decided to pull the cloth back. But what was underneath wasn't the gruesome scene he'd imagined. Just rows of medicine bottles, cold glinting syringes, and a strangely twisted metal claw, eerie in the dim light. Beside it stood a small metal bell, oddly out of place in this dead-silent basement. Almost on impulse, he reached out and picked it up. The sound instantly woke the neighbor. Jake froze, heart pounding. He quickly draped the cloth back over the table. Just then, Sean texted him a warning. Moments later, Jake bolted out of the basement. But he suddenly remembered he hadn't locked the basement door. He set the bell down on a nearby table and rushed back to lock it. By then, the neighbor was already out of his bedroom. They were seconds from running into each other. Sean, watching from his screen, was even more panicked than Jake.
Hide!
With nowhere left to go, Jake dove under the living room table, hiding behind the tablecloth. The neighbor emerged from the bedroom, expressionless. The first thing he did was glance toward the basement. Seeing the door still locked, he turned to grab the basement key. But on his way back, something caught his eye. The metal bell, which should have been in the basement, was sitting on the living room table. And right below it, under the table, was Jake. One glance down, and the neighbor would see him. But what happened next was bone-chilling. The neighbor didn't bend down to look. His face stayed dead, cold, blank. Without a word, he turned and walked back to the bedroom. Sean frantically flipped through cameras searching for him. What he saw next made his blood run cold. The neighbor was holding a handgun, walking with empty eyes straight toward the table where Jake was hiding. A deadly confrontation seemed inevitable. Jake gripped his own gun tightly, ready for whatever came next. After a long silence, the neighbor seemed to make some chilling decision. But what happened next was the last thing anyone expected.
Oh my god!
The thick smell of blood filled the room, cold, sharp, suffocating. Sean saw it on the monitor and tore out of the house, racing next door. Standing in the middle of that horrific scene, both of them froze. Their minds went blank. All that was left was a deep, marrow-deep terror. Only then did it hit them. What they'd done wasn't just spying anymore. They had caused a death. They'd committed an unforgivable crime. Even though the neighbor pulled the trigger himself, they were the reason. Even if they avoided the death penalty, they were almost certainly going to prison. But this wasn't the time to break down. Cleaning up the scene was their only shot at getting away. They rushed to make a plan. Sean would tear out every camera in every room and destroy the evidence. Jake would clean up the blood before it dried, then deal with the body. As long as no one noticed anything for now, they had a chance. But the very next second, police kicked the door in and caught them red-handed.
On the ground now. You, face on the floor, hands on your head.
Soon after, the officer in charge formally pressed charges. Police laid out all their tools and reconstructed the entire prank from beginning to end. Turns out, this so-called social experiment had been a revenge plot from day one. Jake's revenge against his neighbor, Harold. When Jake was 13, his alcoholic father beat his mother. Harold found out and helped Jake's mom call the police. Jake's father went to prison, and his parents divorced. But in Jake's mind, Harold was the one who'd torn his family apart. He'd held a grudge ever since, obsessed with payback.
When I came home that night, I noticed that Ethan had gone through my closet.
And why did this concern you?
Because that's where I kept his father's gun.
Sean was a tech expert with surveillance and audio gear. Jake roped him in under the pretense of pranking the neighbor. Sean had no idea what was really going on. Through their constant surveillance, the two had decided Harold was a creep whose reactions to their pranks weren't normal. They'd convinced themselves he was a hidden, deranged killer. But the truth hit them like a brick. Every paranormal event they staged was a tender memory between Harold and his late wife. The door Harold hacked apart with the axe? It was the one his wife had always complained about.
Harold? This screen door won't stay closed. It keeps popping open.
The stereo that hadn't been touched in years? It was playing his wife's favorite song. Every detail brought Harold's grief flooding back. The night they froze the window until it shattered? That was the very day his wife, Caroline, had been diagnosed with cancer. He'd brought a hospital bed home so he could spend her final days by her side. And that little metal bell Jake rang? It was the last gift Harold ever gave Caroline. He'd promised her, whenever the bell rang, no matter what, he'd come right away. To Harold, the sound of that bell was his late wife calling out to him. Harold's death wasn't out of fear. He was going to her, keeping the promise he'd made. When Jake and Sean watched Harold disappearing into the basement night after night, they had no idea it was just where he kept Caroline's belongings after she passed. Their endless pranks had made Harold believe his late wife was reaching out, asking him to come be with her. After the police searched his basement, he asked the officer over and over if someone had really heard a woman calling from down there. To him, it wasn't a disturbance at all, it was his wife's voice. After the police left, he deliberately left the basement door unlocked. He wanted to hear it for himself, to know if it was really her. In court, Caroline's best friend, Maxine, also stood up for Harold. She'd been Caroline's most trusted friend. On her deathbed, Caroline had begged Maxine to look after Harold. The papers Maxine had been holding that day? They were a spot at a nursing home, something she'd spent 6 months fighting to secure, just to make sure Harold would get proper care. Everything she'd done was to keep her promise to her dying friend. But after Caroline's death, Harold had shut the world out. He'd cut off all contact with Maxine.
He ever mentioned to you why he didn't want to receive proper care?
He never wanted to leave that house. He said Caroline was there.
Will the defendants please rise?
Alone with his grief, in the end, the two boys faced the full weight of the law, but that lost life could never be brought back. They thought they were messing with a creepy old man. Instead, they'd torn open the deepest wound of a heartbroken widower, over and over again, in the cruelest way imaginable. The film The Good Neighbor tells a heartbreaking love story through the eyes of those who spied on it, and the most painful truth it delivers is this: the weirdo you judge from afar might be hiding a tenderness you can't even imagine, and your careless cruelty might just be the final straw that breaks them.